My fiancée let her mom joke about my late wife in front of everyone. So I set the ring on the table and walked out. When I proposed to Stephanie 3 months ago on the beach where we had our first date 2 years earlier, I thought I had finally found my way back to happiness after the darkest period of my life. My first wife, Catherine, had died in a car accident 4 years earlier, leaving me devastated and convinced that I would never love anyone again. Catherine and I had been married for 8 years and were trying to start a family when she was killed by a drunk driver on her way home from work on an ordinary Tuesday evening that became the worst day of my life. The grief that followed Catherine's death was all-consuming and transformative in ways I had never imagined possible. I took extended leave from my job as a software engineer and spent months barely functioning, surviving on the kindness of friends who brought groceries and made sure I was eating something resembling actual meals. Catherine had been my partner, my best friend, and my anchor in the world, and losing her felt like losing half of myself in ways that I couldn't explain to people who had never experienced such devastating loss. Recovery was slow and painful, involving therapy, grief support groups, and the gradual rebuilding of a life that felt completely foreign without Catherine's presence. I learned to cook for one person, to make decisions without consulting someone else, and to find meaning in daily routines that had previously been shared experiences. The process took almost 3 years before I felt ready to consider dating again, and even then I was terrified of betraying Catherine's memory or comparing every new person to someone who could never be replaced. Meeting Stephanie at a coffee shop near my office had been completely unexpected and wonderfully natural. She was a pediatric nurse with a warm smile and genuine interest in other people's stories, and she listened without judgment when I eventually told her about Catherine and the journey that had brought me to where I was in my life. Stephanie seemed to understand that my past wasn't something to be overcome or forgotten, but rather an important part of who I had become. Our relationship developed slowly and carefully, partly because I needed time to process my feelings and partly because Stephanie was patient enough to let me set the pace for emotional intimacy. She never pressured me to remove my wedding ring or pack away Catherine's belongings, and she understood when I needed to visit Catherine's grave on anniversaries or when grief would hit me unexpectedly during holidays or special occasions that triggered memories of my first marriage. Stephanie's acceptance of my grief and her respect for Catherine's place in my history made me fall in love with her in ways that felt both familiar and completely new. She wasn't trying to replace Catherine or compete with a ghost, but rather to build something different and meaningful that honored both my past and our future together. When I finally felt ready to propose, I knew that Catherine would have approved of Stephanie and would have wanted me to find happiness again with someone who understood the importance of love and commitment. The proposal itself was perfect, taking place at sunset on the same beach where Stephanie and I had walked and talked for hours during our first date. I had chosen a ring that was beautiful but completely different from Catherine's, symbolizing the fact that this was a new chapter rather than an attempt to recreate what I had lost. When Stephanie said yes through happy tears, I felt like I was honoring both my past love and my future hope in ways that seemed impossible just a few years earlier. But even during our happiest moments, there were signs that not everyone in Stephanie's family was completely comfortable with my history or supportive of our relationship. Her mother, Ruth, had always been polite but somewhat distant, asking perfunctory questions about my work and interests while never seeming genuinely interested in my answers. I attributed this coolness to normal protective instincts from a mother who wanted to make sure her daughter was making good choices in her romantic relationships. Ruth's attitude became more obviously problematic during family gatherings where she would make subtle comments about second marriages and the challenges of blending different life experiences. She would ask pointed questions about my finances and whether I had properly grieved my first wife before entering a new relationship. These comments were always delivered with a smile and framed as concern for Stephanie's well-being, but the underlying message was clear. Ruth didn't think I was good enough for her daughter. Stephanie would defend me during these conversations and tell her mother that she was being inappropriate, but she also seemed reluctant to confront Ruth directly about the pattern of subtle criticism and undermining comments. She would apologize to me privately after family events and promise to talk to her mother about being more respectful, but these conversations never seemed to result in any meaningful change in Ruth's behavior. The tension came to a head during the planning for our engagement party, which Ruth had insisted on hosting at her house despite Stephanie's preference for a restaurant celebration. Ruth took control of every detail from the guest list to the menu, making decisions that reflected her taste and preferences rather than what Stephanie and I actually wanted for our celebration. When we tried to provide input or make suggestions, Ruth would dismiss our ideas as impractical or inappropriate for the kind of elegant event she was planning. Most troubling was Ruth's insistence that the engagement party should focus on Stephanie's future happiness rather than dwelling on anyone's past relationships. She made it clear that she didn't want any mention of Catherine or acknowledgement of my previous marriage during the celebration, claiming that such references would be depressing and inappropriate for a joyful occasion. When I tried to explain that Catherine was an important part of my story and that pretending she never existed would be dishonest and hurtful, Ruth dismissed my concerns and said that guests didn't need to hear about ancient history. This conflict over how to handle my past during our engagement celebration revealed fundamental differences in how Ruth and I understood the nature of love, loss, and moving forward after tragedy. She seemed to view my marriage to Catherine as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a foundation that had shaped me into the person Stephanie had fallen in love with. Her inability to acknowledge Catherine's importance in my life felt like a rejection of everything that had made our relationship possible and meaningful. As the engagement party approached, I found myself dreading what should have been a celebration of our love and commitment. Ruth's attitude and her control over the event had turned it into a source of stress and conflict rather than joy and anticipation. I worried that her behavior was a preview of what our married life would be like if she continued to view my past as a threat to be managed rather than a reality to be respected and honored. The evening of our engagement party arrived with an unseasonably warm October breeze that should have made the backyard celebration perfect for the 50 guests Ruth had invited to commemorate what she kept calling Stephanie's new beginning. I arrived at Ruth's house an hour early to help with final preparations, hoping that working together on the event might provide an opportunity to establish better understanding between us and set a more positive tone for our future family relationships. But from the moment I walked into Ruth's kitchen, it was clear that she was more focused on orchestrating a performance than creating genuine celebration. She had arranged the decorations and table settings with museum-like precision, and she immediately began giving me instructions about where to stand during toasts and how to interact with guests in ways that would photograph well for the album she was creating to document the evening. Ruth had also prepared talking points about Stephanie's accomplishments and our relationship timeline that carefully omitted any reference to my previous marriage or the circumstances that had led me to be available for this new relationship. When I mentioned that some guests might ask about my background and that I would prefer to be honest about my history rather than awkward and evasive, Ruth firmly told me that the evening was about looking forward rather than dwelling on sad stories that would dampen the celebratory mood. Stephanie arrived shortly after me, looking beautiful in a navy dress that complemented her engagement ring perfectly, but I could see tension in her shoulders that suggested she was also feeling stressed about managing her mother's expectations and her own desires for the evening. When I tried to talk to her privately about my concerns regarding Ruth's restrictions on mentioning Catherine, Stephanie asked me to please just get through the evening without causing conflict because she didn't want to fight with her mother during what should be a happy celebration. This request put me in an impossible position because it essentially asked me to participate in erasing Catherine from my story in order to maintain Ruth's fantasy about what kind of engagement party she wanted to host. I loved Stephanie enough to consider going along with this charade, but I also felt like betraying Catherine's memory in such a public way would damage something fundamental about my integrity and my ability to honor the most important relationship of my first 40 years of life. As guests began arriving for the 6 o'clock start time, I tried to focus on the positive aspects of the evening and the genuine excitement that friends and family members expressed about Stephanie's and my engagement. My college roommate Brian had driven 3 hours to attend, and several of Stephanie's nursing colleagues had come straight from their hospital shifts to celebrate with us. The warmth and support from people who genuinely cared about our happiness helped counteract some of the anxiety I was feeling about Ruth's orchestrated approach to the event. The first hour of the party proceeded smoothly, with guests mingling in the backyard while enjoying appetizers and cocktails that Ruth had catered from an expensive restaurant downtown. I found myself relaxing slightly as conversations flowed naturally and people seemed genuinely happy to celebrate our engagement without the dramatic restrictions and stage management that Ruth had been insisting upon during the planning process. But the underlying tension became apparent when my friend David, who had known Catherine and had been supportive throughout my grieving process, mentioned to another guest how happy he was to see me find love again after such a difficult period. Ruth immediately appeared beside us and redirected the conversation towards Stephanie's career achievements and our plans for the wedding, making it clear that any discussion of my past was unwelcome and inappropriate for the occasion. Similar interventions occurred throughout the evening whenever conversations touched on topics related to my previous marriage or the personal growth that had made my relationship with Stephanie possible. Ruth seemed to be monitoring all interactions to ensure that the narrative remained focused on what she characterized as Stephanie's well-deserved happiness rather than the complex reality of two people building a life together based on their complete histories and experiences. The situation escalated during dinner when Ruth stood up to make what she announced would be the first of several toasts celebrating Stephanie and me. She had clearly prepared remarks that presented our relationship as a fairy tale romance between two people who had found each other at exactly the right time in their lives. According to Ruth's version of events, I had been patiently waiting for the right person to come along, and Stephanie had been focused on her career until she met someone worthy of her attention and affection. This sanitized version of our story completely ignored the reality of loss, grief, recovery, and the courage it had taken for both of us to risk loving again after experiencing disappointment and trauma in our previous relationships. Ruth's toast made it sound like we had simply been two single people who decided to get married, rather than two people who had found each other despite and because of the complicated experiences that had shaped us into who we were. When Ruth finished her prepared remarks and invited other guests to share their thoughts about our engagement, several people offered beautiful and heartfelt comments about love, commitment, and the joy of watching friends find happiness together. But when my friend Michael, who had known both Catherine and me throughout our marriage, began to speak about the strength and resilience I had shown in rebuilding my life, Ruth quickly interrupted him and suggested that we should keep the focus on positive topics rather than dwelling on difficult periods that were now behind us. This interruption was so obviously controlling and inappropriate that several guests looked uncomfortable, and I could see Stephanie's face reddening with embarrassment about her mother's behavior. But instead of addressing Ruth's rudeness or allowing Michael to finish his comments, Stephanie simply smiled tightly and thanked everyone for their kind words, effectively ending the toast segment and moving the evening along to avoid further conflict. The final straw came during dessert when Ruth, emboldened by wine and the apparent success of her previous interventions, decided to make what she probably thought was a clever joke about my previous marriage. In front of all 50 guests, she raised her glass and announced that she was grateful that certain people weren't around to complicate this happy occasion, followed by an exaggerated wink that made it clear she was referring to Catherine. The comment was delivered with a smile and a tone that suggested it was meant to be lighthearted, but the cruelty and disrespect underlying Ruth's words were unmistakable to everyone present. She was essentially celebrating the fact that my first wife was dead because it made my relationship with her daughter possible, and she was doing so in a public forum where she knew I would be expected to smile and accept her humor graciously. The silence that followed Ruth's comment was deafening, with guests looking shocked and uncomfortable while Stephanie sat frozen in her chair, clearly mortified by her mother's behavior but apparently unable to find words to address what had just happened. I waited for Stephanie to defend Catherine's memory or at least acknowledge that her mother's comment had been inappropriate and hurtful, but she remained silent while Ruth continued smiling as if she had made a perfectly acceptable joke. In that moment of silence, I realized that I was facing a choice that would define not just the evening, but the entire future of my relationship with Stephanie and her family. I could pretend that Ruth's comment hadn't been devastating and continue with the charade that this was a normal family celebration, or I could respond honestly to what had just happened and accept the consequences of refusing to participate in the disrespect of Catherine's memory. The silence that followed Ruth's cruel joke seemed to stretch forever as I sat at the beautifully decorated table surrounded by 50 people who had come to celebrate what should have been one of the happiest moments of my life. I could feel every eye in the backyard focused on me, waiting to see how I would respond to a comment that had crossed every line of decency and respect I had thought existed in civilized human interaction. Ruth was still smiling expectantly, apparently believing that her joke about being grateful that certain people weren't around to complicate the occasion was clever wordplay that deserved appreciation rather than the cruel mockery of my deceased wife that it actually represented. Her wine glass remained raised in a toast position, and she seemed genuinely confused by the horrified silence that had greeted her attempt at humor. I looked at Stephanie, desperately hoping that she would step in to defend Catherine's memory or at least acknowledge that her mother had said something unacceptable and hurtful. Stephanie was the woman I loved, the person I had chosen to build a future with, and the one person in that backyard who should have understood how devastating it was to hear my late wife's death treated as a convenient blessing rather than a tragedy that had shaped everything about who I had become. But Stephanie remained frozen in her chair, her face pale and her eyes fixed on her plate, as if she could make the moment disappear by refusing to acknowledge what had just happened. Her silence was more painful than her mother's cruelty because it revealed that when forced to choose between protecting her relationship with her mother and defending the memory of the woman whose death had made our love possible, she was choosing to protect Ruth rather than stand up for what was right. The other guests were beginning to shift uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly recognizing that something terrible had just occurred but uncertain about how to respond to such an unprecedented breach of basic human decency. Several of my friends looked angry and ready to speak up on my behalf, but they were also aware that confronting the hostess of the party would create even more drama and conflict during what was supposed to be a celebration. I realized in that moment that I was completely alone at my own engagement party, surrounded by people who cared about me, but facing a situation where no one else could or would take responsibility for addressing what had just happened. The woman I planned to marry was too intimidated by her mother to defend basic principles of respect and compassion, and the woman who was supposed to become my mother-in-law had just celebrated my first wife's death as a blessing that made her daughter's happiness possible. The choice I faced was stark and irreversible. I could smile and pretend that Ruth's comment had been acceptable, allowing the evening to continue while swallowing my outrage and betraying everything I believed about love, loyalty, and respect for the dead. Or I could respond honestly to what had just happened, knowing that such a response would likely end my engagement and destroy my relationship with Stephanie in front of everyone we cared about. As I considered these options, I thought about Catherine and what she would have expected from me in this situation. She had been a woman of fierce integrity who never allowed people to treat her or others with disrespect, and she had always supported me in standing up for my principles even when doing so was difficult or costly. Catherine would have been appalled by Ruth's comment, but she would have been even more disappointed if I had allowed such cruelty to pass without response. I also thought about what kind of marriage I would be entering if I allowed this precedent to be established at the very beginning of my engagement. If Stephanie couldn't defend Catherine's memory when her mother mocked my late wife's death in front of 50 people, how could I trust her to support me during future conflicts with her family? How could I build a life with someone who would allow her mother to treat the most important relationship of my past as a joke to be mocked rather than a loss to be respected? The practical considerations were also significant because Ruth's attitude toward Catherine and my grief wasn't likely to improve after the wedding. If anything, becoming an official family member would probably embolden Ruth to make even more inappropriate comments and demands about how I should handle my past and my memories. The dynamic that was being established at this engagement party would define our entire future relationship if I allowed it to continue unchallenged. I stood up slowly from my chair, and the movement seemed to break the spell of paralyzed silence that had gripped the entire party. Every conversation stopped, and every face turned toward me as guests realized that something significant was about to happen. Stephanie looked up at me with an expression of fear and pleading, clearly hoping that I would find some way to smooth over the situation without creating the confrontation that everyone could sense was coming. I reached across the table and picked up my wine glass, and for a moment Ruth seemed to think that I was going to join her toast and participate in her cruel joke about Catherine's death. Her smile broadened as she raised her own glass higher, apparently believing that she had successfully navigated a potentially awkward moment and that the evening could now continue as planned. Instead, I set my wine glass down carefully on the table without drinking from it, And then I did something that felt both spontaneous and inevitable given everything that had led to this moment. I removed my engagement ring and placed it gently on the table next to my untouched wine. The simple action speaking louder than any words I could have chosen to express my response to what had just occurred. The gasps from around the table were audible as guests realized what my action signified, and Stephanie's face went completely white as she understood that her silence in the face of her mother's cruelty had just cost her our engagement. Ruth's expression changed from smug satisfaction to confused alarm as she began to comprehend that her joke had not been received as the clever comment she had intended. I looked directly at Ruth and spoke in a voice that was calm, but carried clearly across the silent backyard. Catherine was my wife, and she died in a car accident 4 years ago. She was a good person who deserved better than to have her death mocked as a convenience for your daughter's happiness. I will not marry into a family that treats the loss of someone I loved as a joke to be celebrated. Then I turned to Stephanie, who was staring at the engagement ring on the table as if she couldn't believe what was happening. I love you, but I can't marry someone who won't defend the basic principle that the dead deserve respect, especially when that person was my wife. Your mother's comment was cruel and unacceptable, and your silence in response to it tells me everything I need to know about what our marriage would be like. Without waiting for responses from either of them, I walked away from the table and through the house toward the front door, leaving behind the engagement party that had become a monument to cruelty and cowardice. Behind me, I could hear Stephanie calling my name and Ruth trying to explain that she had just been making a light-hearted comment that I had misunderstood, but I didn't turn around or slow down. As I reached my car and drove away from Ruth's house, I felt a strange mixture of devastation and relief. I had just ended my engagement and destroyed my relationship with the woman I had thought I would marry, but I had also refused to compromise my integrity or betray Catherine's memory for the sake of maintaining a relationship that was built on the expectation that I would accept disrespect and cruelty from my future family. The drive home from Ruth's house felt like traveling through a surreal landscape where everything looked familiar, but nothing felt real anymore. 3 hours earlier, I had been an engaged man preparing to celebrate my future with the woman I loved and the community of friends and family who supported our relationship. Now I was single again, having walked away from what should have been one of the happiest evenings of my life because the woman I had planned to marry couldn't find the courage to defend basic human decency when her mother mocked my late wife's death. My phone started ringing before I even reached my apartment, with calls from Stephanie that I let go to voicemail because I wasn't ready to hear her explanations or apologies for what had just happened. I knew that talking to her immediately would only lead to arguments about whether I had overreacted or whether there might have been some way to salvage the evening without such a dramatic response to her mother's cruelty. When I finally listened to Stephanie's messages an hour later, they followed a predictable pattern of minimizing her mother's behavior while suggesting that I had embarrassed everyone by making such a scene over what she characterized as a thoughtless comment rather than a deliberate insult. According to Stephanie's version of events, Ruth had simply made a poor choice of words while trying to express happiness about our engagement, and my response had been disproportionate to the offense. But Stephanie's attempts to reframe what had happened couldn't change the fundamental reality of what I had witnessed at that engagement party. Her mother had explicitly celebrated Catherine's death as a blessing that made her daughter's happiness possible, and Stephanie had chosen to remain silent rather than defend the memory of someone whose loss had shaped everything about my capacity for love and commitment. The phone calls and text messages continued throughout the weekend, with Stephanie alternating between apologies for her mother's behavior and arguments about whether ending our engagement had been necessary or fair given the circumstances. She claimed that she had been shocked into silence by Ruth's comment and hadn't known how to respond in the moment, but that she would have addressed the situation privately with her mother after the party ended. These explanations might have been convincing if the engagement party had been an isolated incident, but Ruth's attitude toward Catherine and my grief had been problematic throughout our entire relationship. The cruel joke had simply been the culmination of months of subtle disrespect and attempts to erase my past rather than accept it as an important part of who I had become. My friends who had attended the party reached out to express their support for my decision and their shock at Ruth's behavior. Brian told me that he had never seen anything so cruel and inappropriate at a social gathering, and that several guests had been discussing how appalled they were by Ruth's comment and Stephanie's failure to respond appropriately. David said that Catherine would have been proud of me for refusing to accept such disrespect, even at the cost of my future happiness. These conversations with friends helped validate my decision to end the engagement, but they also highlighted how isolated I had become within what should have been my new family circle. The fact that multiple people had recognized Ruth's comment as unacceptably cruel made Stephanie's inability to defend basic principles of respect even more troubling and disappointing. Ruth herself called me 3 days after the party to offer what she characterized as an apology for the misunderstanding that had occurred during the celebration. According to her version of events, she had simply been trying to express gratitude that I was available for a relationship with her daughter, and she claimed that any reference to Catherine's death had been unintentional and misinterpreted. This attempted apology was almost as insulting as the original comment because it required me to accept that celebrating my wife's death had been accidental rather than deliberate. Ruth seemed to believe that claiming ignorance about the impact of her words would somehow make them less hurtful, but her refusal to acknowledge the cruelty of what she had said only confirmed that she lacked the basic empathy necessary for healthy family relationships. When I explained to Ruth that her comment had been deliberately cruel and that I couldn't maintain relationships with people who mocked the death of someone I had loved, she became defensive and accused me of being oversensitive about past events that I should have moved beyond by now. She suggested that my attachment to Catherine's memory was unhealthy and that any woman who married me would have to compete with a ghost. This response revealed the fundamental misunderstanding that had been driving Ruth's behavior throughout my relationship with Stephanie. She viewed Catherine as a competitor to be eliminated rather than an important part of my history that deserved respect and acknowledgement. Her inability to understand that honoring my late wife's memory was compatible with loving her daughter made it clear that we could never coexist peacefully within the same family structure. Stephanie made one final attempt to salvage our relationship by suggesting that we could limit contact with her mother and build our marriage around boundaries that would prevent future incidents like the engagement party disaster. She claimed that she understood now how serious the situation was and that she was willing to prioritize our relationship over her mother's comfort and preferences. But Stephanie's proposed solution missed the fundamental issue that had ended our engagement. The problem wasn't just Ruth's cruelty, but Stephanie's inability to defend basic principles of respect and decency when doing so required confronting her mother. If she couldn't stand up for Catherine's memory when her mother mocked my late wife's death in front of 50 people, how could I trust her to support me during future conflicts that might be less clear-cut or dramatic? The conversation where I explained this to Stephanie was heartbreaking because I could hear in her voice that she genuinely loved me and was devastated by the loss of our future together. But love without the courage to defend what is right isn't sufficient for building a marriage that can withstand the challenges and conflicts that inevitably arise when two families merge into one. 6 months after the engagement party, I heard through mutual friends that Stephanie was dating someone else and seemed to be moving on from our relationship successfully. Ruth had apparently learned nothing from the experience and continued to make inappropriate comments about Stephanie's new boyfriend, suggesting that her behavior toward me had been part of a pattern rather than an isolated incident. I felt genuine sadness that Stephanie had been unable to break free from her mother's toxic influence and establish boundaries that would allow her to build healthy adult relationships. But I also felt relief that I had discovered this fundamental incompatibility before making legal and emotional commitments that would have been much more difficult to dissolve after marriage. Today, when I think about Catherine, I remember her with love and gratitude rather than the bitterness and resentment that might have developed if I had allowed her memory to be mocked and disrespected for the sake of maintaining a relationship that required me to compromise my integrity. Walking away from that engagement party was one of the hardest things I have ever done, but it was also one of the most important because it honored both my past love and my future possibility for happiness with someone who shares my values about respect, loyalty, and the importance of defending what is right even when doing so is difficult or costly.